parents of superheroes have survival rates lower than parents in Disney movies, so it's not shocking to know Peter Parker is an orphan. We all know he was taken in by his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, but who were his parents? Even in the comics, they're rarely mentioned. But with the Spider-Man franchise being rebooted and all, we're going to be talking about what might have happened to them. Before we delve into this fascinating fan theory about Richard and Mary Parker, subscribe to CBR and ring that bell to join our notification squad so you never miss any of our MCU videos. Everybody knows that Peter Parker is an orphan who was brought up by his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. People tend to get caught up on the whole bitten by a radioactive spider part of Peter Parker's life. It's rare that anyone stops to ask just what happened to Peter's parents. Sure, they're gone, but what were they like when they were alive? Would they have approved of their son's web-slinging antics? And just how did they lose their lives in the first place? For ages in the movies and comic books, we wondered why Aunt May and Uncle Ben were so much older than Peter. They always looked more like his grandparents than his aunt and uncle, but now Aunt May is played by Marissa Tomei and Uncle Ben is no longer in the picture at all. According to Marvel Studios' Kevin Feige, Uncle Ben was omitted from the movie because the studio is trying to take the character in a brand new direction. Uncle Ben is someone Spider-Man fans all know well, and right now, Marvel is focused on bringing new things into the MCU, instead of just rehashing old characters. So if there was ever a time to learn more about Peter Parker's parents, it seems as though this would be it. After all, theirs is a story which has rarely been told, even in the comic books. All we knew was that the Parkers had perished in a car crash at some point when Peter was a child. Spider-Man Homecoming introduced us to a modern Spider-Man, and we aren't just talking about his pop culture references. There are some things which happened during the movie that make us wonder if the story of Richard and Mary Parker could be even sadder than we thought. In the beginning of the film, Peter Parker exclaims to Happy that this is the first time he's ever been on a plane. This in and of itself isn't that unusual. Many people, especially teens, haven't been on planes before. But flying and heights are a frequent cause of stress and danger for Peter Parker throughout the movie. We see him struggle against the airborne villain Vulture and almost drown as a result. Sure, he swings on his webbing, but whenever there's too much distance between himself and the ground, we see Peter Parker start to panic. When he realizes that his friend Ned is unwittingly holding onto a Chitauri bomb, Peter races to the Washington Monument to save the day, but once he gets to the top of the spire, Peter absolutely panics. According to writers Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly, they wanted to show that being bitten by a radioactive spider doesn't make you completely fearless. Most of us have experienced a fear of heights or vertigo, and it's something that Peter struggles with as well. Sure, he can shoot webbing, but he's made of fragile flesh and bones, just like the rest of us. Height is a pretty reasonable fear, even for a superhero. But it could also be a clue to something bigger. So, now we know Peter has avoided flying for whatever reason prior to this movie, and that he's afraid of heights. This is also addressed in the Spider-Man game for PlayStation 4, in which Peter Parker climbs the Empire State Building in order to conquer his fear of heights. Now, let's talk timelines. Specifically, let's talk about the timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Prior to the Avengers, things were a bit murky time-wise, but since then, the movies seem to be happening in real time. According to Marvel Studios, the Avengers took place in the year 2012, and 4 years later, in 2016, we saw Spider-Man appear in Captain America: Civil War. Spider-Man Homecoming takes place just a couple of months afterwards, and Avengers: Infinity War took place in 2018. You still with us? Okay, good. We have just a couple more numbers for you. During Spider-Man Homecoming, we learned that Peter Parker is 15 years old, meaning he was born in 2001. As we all know, 2001 was the year in which the September 11th terrorist attacks took place in New York City. Peter Parker would have been a baby at the time this horrible tragedy took place. Some fans wonder if Richard and Mary Parker might have been among the many victims of this terrible event. The timeline seems to align pretty well, and it would certainly explain Peter's fear of height and his inexperience with airplanes. Some people wonder if 9/11 would have taken place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that's a fair question. In Iron Man, Tony Stark was selling weapons to the United States military in Afghanistan. Then, during the movie Iron Man 3, Killian mentions Osama bin Laden specifically, so it seems as though the September 11th attacks did take place in the MCU, even if they've never been explicitly talked about. Everyone knows Peter Parker is our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and that neighborhood is New York City. It's an important setting and plays a big role in his life during Spider-Man Homecoming. Having his parents perish on 9/11 would add an interesting dimension to the film and to the character of Peter Parker. Near the end of the movie, we see Peter desperately trying to stop a plane from crashing into the city, where Peter has been stripped of his high-tech costume, trapped under rubble, and was now having to fight a sky-high, plane-based battle. With all that in mind, this theory is actually pretty heartbreaking. and would have made the situation exponentially more difficult for Peter. This theory does seem like it would fit in as a modern retelling of Peter Parker's parents based on what we know about them from the movies and comic books. During The Amazing Spider-Man, we finally saw Richard and Mary Parker on screen, bidding a fond farewell to a young Peter. As he leaves his son with his aunt and uncle, Richard tells Peter that leaving is something the pair have to do. This was barely a blip in the movie, but it was much more than we had seen so far of the Parkers. Aunt May claims Richard was planning to sell weapons to foreign powers, but there's more to the story. Peter discovers that his father was actually trying to prevent his scientific discoveries from being used to create weapons. We also learn the spider which turned Peter Parker into Spider-Man was one of Richard's creations. It's safe to say Peter's parents have had a pretty inconsequential portrayal in cinema so far, but this is one of the things which could end up changing with Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Remember that hilariously awkward scene in Spider-Man Homecoming when Tony Stark reached over Peter to unlock the door? It was funny, but also a little bit sad how desperately Peter wanted a father-like figure in his life. We saw his relationship with Tony develop through this movie and Avengers Infinity War. While we love the relationship between them, it does make us wonder about Peter's biological father. Could we finally be getting some answers during the upcoming Spider-Man Far From Home? In the comic books, it took forever to learn anything about the Parkers, but we'll tell you what we do know. Richard Parker was a soldier in the Special Forces who was recruited into S.H.I.E.L.D. by none other than Nick Fury himself. He met CIA agent Mary Fitzpatrick while on the job, and the two fell in love and got married. During their last fateful mission, Richard and Mary left their son Peter with relatives and headed out on a plane. Albert Malik, the third Red Skull, sabotaged that plane, causing it to crash and its passengers to perish. We first met the comic book version of Peter Parker way back in 1962 when he was living with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but we had to wait 6 years until The Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 5 in 1968 before we learned what had really happened to his parents. For a long time, all we knew was that they were secret agents who had perished in a plane crash. It wasn't until The Parents of Peter Parker was released in 1997 that we found out about Richard and Mary Parker working for S.H.I.E.L.D. at all. Sure, we love learning things about our favorite characters, but we also want to know about the pivotal events which led to them becoming who they are today. Can Peter Parker's fear of heights be attributed to the way his parents died? It's clear Marvel was in no hurry to introduce us to these characters, even though they'd provide interesting insight into Peter Parker. Richard and Mary Parker have to be two of the least mentioned characters in all of Marvel, despite being responsible for one of the most well-loved comic book characters of all time. The Parkers' involvement with S.H.I.E.L.D. is particularly interesting, considering what's currently going on in the MCU. During the post-credit scene in Avengers Infinity War, we saw S.H.I.E.L.D. agents Nick Fury and Maria Hill. We assume they'll both survive the events of Avengers 4 because they're set to reprise their roles during Spider-Man Far From Home. So it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that Peter Parker will be interacting with Nick Fury to some degree in that movie. If Nick Fury's relationship with Peter Parker becomes canon in the MCU, it's possible we could learn a lot more about Peter's parents. When Peter turned down Tony's offer to become an Avenger, he made it clear he was trying to focus on living a normal life. According to Kevin Feige, we'll see Peter operating with the same goal in mind during Far From Home. We think it's pretty standard to want to learn more about your relatives, especially if this theory is correct and Peter's parents died when he was just a baby. If Peter Parker's parents really did lose their lives during the September 11th attacks, this would mean the events officially occurred in the MCU. Marvel Studios has spent so much time and care cultivating its universe, and its fans love to see where it crosses over with the real world. There are many reasons to love Spider-Man, but one of them is that he's a fairly average person in a whole lot of ways. Sure, he has superpowers, but outside of that, he's just an occasionally awkward teenager trying to get through school. It's something many fans can relate to, and it's what made him stand out among a sea of other superheroes when the comic first debuted. Adding a real-world event which many of us lived through to Peter Parker's backstory would be something truly interesting. After all, we know Captain America experienced World War II, so there's a precedent for heroes being affected by actual real-world catastrophes. Sure, this theory about Peter's parents wouldn't dramatically change things, but it would make things more interesting and make Peter a more compelling character. It would also finally give us an answer to what happened to Peter Parker's parents in the MCU. After all, if they're gonna kill off Uncle Ben and totally reinvent Aunt May, it seems like we should at least address what happened to Richard and Mary. Spider-Man Far From Home will have Peter Parker traveling, well, far from home. If Richard and Mary were S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, it's likely their missions took them all over the world. It's possible that Peter could find himself in a position to learn a lot more about his parents and the type of people that they were. In the comic books, Peter Parker eventually decides to find out what happened to his parents. His mission takes him all the way to Algeria, and we could see the MCU version of Peter Parker undertaking a similar journey, especially if he was already involved with S.H.I.E.L.D. to some degree and was already in another country. We know this version of Spider-Man is supposed to be taking us in new directions, but learning more about his parents would honestly be pretty surprising. With the first Spider-Man movie starring Tobey Maguire, we pretty much had the mere mention of parents, and then in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 starring Andrew Garfield, we got slightly more than that. Maybe it's time we actually learned about Peter Parker's past and how it ties him to S.H.I.E.L.D., the MCU, and New York City as we know it. This fan theory might just be fun speculation for now, but we would love to know what really happened to Parker's parents. That was the sad story of Spider-Man's parents. It certainly brings a tear to our eye. What do you think happened to Richard and Mary Parker in the MCU? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below, and please don't forget to subscribe to CBR for more MCU videos just like this one. Thanks for watching.